The banner was still warm when I was ordered to catalogue it. I stood in the designated inspection zone, a cordoned square of scorched earth marked by stanchions and ritual tape, watching two guardsmen lower the seized orc glyph onto the examination trestle. The fabric, if it could be called fabric, released heat into the frozen air. Steam rose from its surface. The pyres had been extinguished less than an hour before, and ash still drifted across the plateau like grey snow. The wind carried the smell of promethium and burned meat. I positioned my data slate at the prescribed angle, adjusted my respirator, and began the liturgy of inspection. Form 771B. Verification of Xenos superstition residue. 17 steps, each to be performed in order, each to be witnessed and countersigned. The guardsmen stood at attention on either side of the trestle, lasguns held across their chests, eyes fixed on the middle distance. Neither looked at the banner, neither looked at me. Their breath condensed in small clouds. I could hear the idling engines of the chimeras staged beyond the perimeter, ready to evacuate us before the orbital strike. We had 6 hours until sanitation. The operation was already behind schedule. I activated my slate and spoke the opening recitation. My voice emerged flat through the respirator's Vox grill, stripped of inflection by the filter. The words were familiar, worn smooth by repetition. I had conducted 43 battlefield audits in the 17 months since my reassignment to this compliance theater. This was the final task before departure. The enemy was broken. The moon would be sterilized. The records would be sealed and archived. My duty was enumeration, not interpretation. I was to measure, classify, and document. The administratum would determine meaning. I was simply the instrument of observation. The banner measured approximately 4 meters in width and 7 in length. The material appeared to be layered hides stitched together with what analysis would later confirm was sinew and wire. The glyph itself dominated the center. A crude depiction of a clenched fist gripping a blade, rendered in what appeared to be dried blood mixed with industrial pigment. Around the edges, smaller glyphs formed a border. I began photographing each section, following the mandated sequence. Upper left quadrant, upper right, center mass, lower sections. Detail captures of significant markings. The slate's machine spirit whirred softly, processing each image, assigning file designations. It was during the border documentation that I noticed the tallies. They were scratched into the hide beneath the paint, visible only when light struck the surface at certain angles. Short vertical marks grouped in clusters. I counted the first cluster, 5 marks. A 6th mark crossed diagonally. Standard tally notation. I moved to the next cluster. 7 marks, crossed, then 9, then 14. I continued around the border, my stylus tapping each cluster into the slate's memory. The guardsmen shifted weight. One coughed. I ignored them and maintained focus. 42 clusters in total, arranged in a circuit around the primary glyph. Each cluster represented a count. Each count required verification. I cross-referenced the tallies against the campaign casualty logs stored in my slate's archive. The numbers aligned. The first cluster matched the confirmed kill during the initial landing at Tertius Ridge. The second cluster corresponded to losses sustained during the advance on Forge Ancillary Sigma 7. The third matched casualties from the ambush at the mineral extraction corridor. I continued through the sequence. Every cluster found its match. The alignment was exact. This should not have been possible. The banner had been recovered from an orc warband destroyed during the second week of operations. Intelligence reports confirmed the glyph had been raised before our initial orbital insertion, displayed prominently during the enemy's counter-advance. The orcs could not have known our casualty figures. Those reports had been transmitted via encrypted Vox to Munitorum Command and remained classified at Operational Clearance Theta. Regimental commanders received sanitized summaries only. Even most officers lacked access to precise tallies. Yet the banner documented them with absolute accuracy, recorded before the battles occurred. I rechecked the image timestamps. I verified the intelligence report dates. I reviewed the Vox transmission logs. The discrepancy persisted. The Orcs had carved our losses into their banner before we suffered them. Doctrine offered no provision for this. I stood motionless, stylus hovering over the slate. The wind shifted, carrying fresh ash across the inspection zone. One of the guardsmen cleared his throat. Procedure required I complete the documentation. Procedure required I note all anomalies. Procedure required I submit findings without interpretation or speculation. I had been trained to observe, not to question. Questions implied doubt. Doubt implied heresy. I was a scribe, not a theologian. My faith was expressed through accuracy. I logged the tally correspondence as Observation Item 7, Subsection Xenos Behavioral Patterns, Notation Type Unexplained. I did not speculate. I did not offer theory. I simply recorded that the numbers matched and that the timeline presented inconsistency requiring doctrinal clarification. The words felt insufficient. They described the surface without acknowledging the weight beneath. But they were correct. They followed form. I appended the required certifications, applied my seal, and transmitted the report to my immediate superior. The response arrived within 17 minutes. Preserve banner for extended study. Do not incinerate with remaining materiel. Assign archive classification pending. Continue with standard sanitation protocol for all other items. Acknowledge receipt. I acknowledged. The guardsmen received new orders via their Vox beads and moved to cover the banner with sanctified tarpaulin. They worked quickly, avoiding direct contact with the hide. Within minutes, the banner was loaded onto a cargo sledge and transported to the designated preservation vault, a reinforced bunker 3 kilometers from the inspection zone. I watched the sledge disappear into the haze of industrial smoke that blanketed the plateau. My hands were shaking. I attributed this to cold. The orbital strike commenced 4 hours later, precisely on schedule. I observed from the embarkation deck of the transport ship, watching through reinforced viewports as las fire rained down in geometric patterns. The plateau became light, then it became absence. The Orc encampments, the abandoned trenches, the makeshift fortifications all converted to vapor and heat. The surface temperature would remain lethal for weeks. Nothing would survive. The moon would be reclassified as administratum reserve territory and sealed against settlement for 5 generations. This was standard. This was correct. I felt no satisfaction. That night, aboard the transport during warp transit to the fleet assembly point, I lay in my assigned berth and reviewed the images stored in my slate. I examined each tally cluster. I recounted them. I verified the casualty matches. The numbers did not change. The alignment remained exact. I thought about the Orcs carving those marks into hide, their crude fingers moving with purpose, marking deaths that had not yet occurred. I thought about the commanders who had ordered those advances, unaware that the enemy already knew the cost. I thought about faith and how it was supposed to render uncertainty irrelevant. I thought about the banner, preserved in a vault, waiting. Sleep did not come. I lay still and listened to the ship's machinery humming through the hull. Somewhere in the administrative decks above, my report existed in a queue, awaiting review, awaiting integration into the greater archive. Somewhere below, in the cargo holds, soldiers slept in their berths, dreaming of home or nothing. I wondered if any of them had seen the banner. I wondered if any had noticed the tallies. I wondered if it mattered. The administratum had taught me that uncertainty was temporary. Doctrine provided clarity. Numbers provided truth. Faith provided strength. I repeated these principles silently, shaping them into a rhythm that matched my breathing. The words felt thinner than usual. They still felt necessary. I did not yet understand that preservation was not mercy. I did not yet understand that some observations could not be unlearned. I believed the system knew what it was doing. I believed my unease would fade with distance and routine. I believed that correct procedure would resolve all discrepancies. I was wrong. The transit lasted 11 days. I spent them in ritual and routine. Morning ablutions at the 6th hour. Ink sanctification at the 7th. 2 hours of data reconciliation before the midday meal. Afternoon prayer in the ship's chapel, a narrow compartment lined with scrollwork and devotional texts. Evening duties consisted of archival maintenance and seal verification. I maintained this schedule without deviation. Routine was armor against doubt. Repetition was faith made tangible. The other scribes aboard the transport maintained similar schedules, though we rarely spoke beyond the exchange of necessary information. Conversation invited distraction. Silence preserved focus. We worked in parallel, each attending to our assigned domains, each maintaining the machinery of imperial record-keeping. I found comfort in this collective silence. It confirmed that my purpose was shared, that I was not isolated but integrated into something vast and necessary. On the 4th day, I received a commendation. The message arrived via internal vox, transmitted from the ship's administratum liaison. My audit work on the compliance campaign had been reviewed and deemed exemplary. All documentation met or exceeded standard. My notation discipline was cited as a model for junior scribes. The commendation would be entered into my permanent record. I accepted this without pride. Pride implied ego. Ego implied separation from duty. I was pleased only that I had performed correctly. The banner was not mentioned. On the 7th day, I was summoned to the senior archive deck for a briefing. I arrived at the designated time, carrying my slate and seal case, wearing my formal scribe vestments. The compartment was larger than those assigned to my grade, furnished with proper desks and climate-controlled storage. Senior Logister Venn sat behind a mahogany writing surface, reviewing a stack of parchment requisitions. He did not look up when I entered. I stood at attention and waited. After 3 minutes, he spoke. His voice carried the rasp of age and augmetic enhancement. He asked if I understood why my report on the Orc glyph banner had been flagged for review. I replied that I did not. He nodded, still focused on his parchments. He explained that the Munitorum received thousands of battlefield audits each month. Most contained minor anomalies, temperature variations, material degradation, transcription errors. These were expected. These were managed through standard correction protocols. My report, he said, was different. He finally looked at me. His eyes were wet and colorless, magnified slightly by optical augments embedded in his skull. He asked if I had speculated about the meaning of the tally correspondence. I replied that I had not. Speculation was not my role. He nodded again, satisfied. He explained that speculation invited contamination of data. Pure observation required disciplined restraint. I had demonstrated this restraint. This was good. He then informed me that the banner had been transferred to a specialized facility for further study. The facility's designation was classified above my clearance. The study would be conducted by personnel trained in xenological threat assessment. My involvement was complete. I was instructed to delete all locally stored images and references to the banner from my slate. Official records would be maintained in the central archive. I was to speak of the banner only if directly questioned by authorized personnel. This was not censorship, he explained. This was proper information compartmentalization. I complied immediately. I initiated the deletion sequence and watched the files dissolve into the slate's memory void. The machine spirit confirmed erasure. Senior Logister Venn witnessed this and applied his seal to a verification form. He thanked me for my diligence and dismissed me. I returned to my compartment and resumed my duties. The deletion felt correct. It reduced unnecessary cognitive burden. I had other audits to process, other data to reconcile. The banner was someone else's concern now. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt observed. This sensation persisted through the remaining days of transit. I noticed myself checking over my shoulder during data entry. I found myself hesitating before submitting reports, rereading them for unintended implications. I began to wonder if certain phrasings might be misinterpreted, if certain observations might trigger additional scrutiny. This was irrational. My work was correct. My faith was intact, yet the feeling remained. On the 10th day, I overheard a conversation between two junior scribes in the archival stacks. They were discussing rumors of orc activity in a neighboring sector. One claimed the Greenskins had somehow anticipated Imperial fleet movements, staging ambushes at emergence points that should have been secure. The other dismissed this as guard exaggeration. Orcs were too stupid for strategy, he said. Their victories were statistical inevitabilities, the result of overwhelming numbers and savage persistence. They did not plan. They simply attacked until they died or won. I said nothing. I retrieved my required documents and departed. The conversation was not my concern. Rumors were not data. I had no reason to connect their words to the banner, yet I did. That night I lay in my berth and attempted prayer. The words came automatically, shaped by years of recitation. I asked the Emperor for clarity. I asked for strength to serve without question. I asked for peace. The words felt hollow. Not false, but insufficient, like a formula missing variables. I continued anyway. Faith was not measured by feeling. Faith was measured by persistence. The ship translated back to real space on the 11th day. We docked at Fleet Assembly Anchorage Gamma 19, a vast orbital station serving as the logistical hub for 3 active compliance theaters. I disembarked with the other scribes and was assigned temporary quarters in the station's administratum wing. My next deployment would be determined within 48 hours. Until then, I was to remain available and maintain standard duties. I spent the waiting period organizing my archive backups and updating my certification logs. The work was mechanical, requiring minimal thought. This was welcome. I did not want to think about the banner. I did not want to think about the tallies. I wanted to return to the certainty I had felt before the audit. I wanted numbers to be simply numbers again. On the 2nd day, I received my new assignment. I was to join the Munitorum contingent attached to the 88th Cadian Regiment, currently engaged in suppression operations on the hive world Veraxis Prime. The deployment was expected to last 18 months. My role would be standard: casualty reconciliation, supply chain documentation, and morale metric compilation. The orders included a notation that my recent commendation made me suitable for expanded responsibilities. I would be granted access to operational clearance Sigma materials. I accepted the assignment without hesitation. Veraxis Prime was 3 sectors away from the compliance moon. The distance felt appropriate. The transport to Veraxis departed 6 hours later. I boarded carrying my seal case, my slate, and a small trunk of personal effects. The transit would take 19 days. I settled into my assigned compartment and resumed my routines. Morning ablutions, ink sanctification, data reconciliation, prayer. The rhythm was soothing. The days blurred together in productive sameness. On the 4th day of transit, I received a Vox message from an unknown sender. The message was text only, transmitted via encrypted administratum channel. It contained a single line: banner study suspended pending inquisitorial review. No further action required. I read the message 3 times. I checked the authentication codes. They were valid. I saved the message to my secure archive and deleted it from active memory. No further action required. The words were clear. I was to do nothing. I was to forget. I could not forget. That night, I dreamed of tallies. Vertical marks scratched into hide, carved into stone, burned into metal. Each mark precise. Each mark counting something I could not see but knew was coming. I woke with my hands clenched, nails digging into palms. The chronometer read 3:47 station standard. I lay still and focused on breathing. In, out, measured, controlled. I thought about the orcs. I thought about the catechisms I had memorized regarding their nature. Xenos belligerent grade extremis. Threat level assessed through population density and available resources. Psychological profile: resistant to fear, incapable of strategic planning, driven by instinctual aggression. Their weapons functioned poorly but sufficiently. Their tactics relied on mass and momentum. They won through attrition, not cunning. This was doctrine. This was truth. But doctrine had not explained the tallies. I rose from my berth and activated my slate. I accessed the public Munitorum database and searched for references to Orc precognition. The search returned 847 documents. Most were classified above my clearance. The accessible files contained only generalities. Notes on Orc weird boys who exhibited unstable psychic phenomena, reports of greenskin mobs attacking at opportune moments, observations of enemy movements that seemed coordinated despite lacking command structure. None mentioned predictive accuracy. None mentioned tallies. I broadened the search. I looked for patterns of Orc engagement across multiple campaigns. I found records of battles where the enemy had concentrated forces at critical junctures, where they had exploited weaknesses in Imperial lines that intelligence had not yet identified, where they had pressed attacks exactly when reinforcements were delayed. Each incident was explained through standard analysis: coincidence, opportunism, the inevitable result of sustained aggression. The explanations felt rehearsed. I closed the database and returned to my berth. I did not sleep. I thought about Senior Logister Ven's eyes, magnified and wet, watching me delete the files. I thought about the banner, sealed in some facility I would never see, examined by specialists I would never meet. I thought about the commendation in my record, the praise for my restraint. I wondered if restraint was the same as blindness. Veraxis Prime appeared through the viewport 3 weeks later, a mottled sphere of grey and rust, its surface obscured by industrial haze. The hive cities rose like boils from the polluted crust, their spires lost in toxic cloud layers. The 88th Cadian was deployed across 3 primary hives, engaged in suppression operations against what the briefing materials described as localized Xenos insurgency. The briefing did not specify which Xenos. I assumed this would be clarified upon arrival. The assumption was correct. The Xenos were Orcs. I learned this during the initial orientation, conducted in a reinforced bunker beneath Hive Tertius. The briefing officer, a major whose name I did not retain, explained the situation with practiced efficiency. The Orc presence had been detected 6 months prior, manifesting as coordinated raids on outlying manufactoria. Initial assessments suggested a minor warband, easily contained. Subsequent engagements revealed greater numbers and unexpected organization. The Greenskins had established fortified positions in the Underhive warrens and were showing unusual tactical discipline. The Major emphasized that despite these complications, the enemy remained fundamentally predictable. Orcs were Orcs. They attacked, they died, they were replaced. The campaign would succeed through systematic elimination and resource denial. My role was to ensure accurate documentation of this process. I accepted my assigned duties and reported to the Munitorum archive station. The facility was a repurposed storage vault, its walls lined with data stacks and filing cabinets. 3 other scribes worked in rotation, each maintaining separate documentation streams. I was assigned casualty reconciliation and enemy materiel cataloging. The work was familiar. The routines were identical to my previous deployments. I found comfort in this sameness. The comfort lasted 4 days. On the 5th day, I received a request from Tactical Command. They required verification of enemy equipment recovery logs. Specifically, they wanted confirmation that Orc weapons seized during recent raids matched the specifications recorded in earlier engagements. This was standard quality control. I retrieved the relevant files and began comparison analysis. The specifications matched. Too precisely. Orc weapons were notorious for their crude variability. No 2 were exactly alike. Each was cobbled together from scrap and instinct, held together by welds and what the tech priests called unreliable functionality. Yet the weapons recovered over the past 3 months showed consistent design elements. Barrel lengths within 5% deviation, firing mechanisms using identical configuration patterns. Even the scrap metal sources appeared coordinated, suggesting access to specific salvage streams. I cross-referenced the recovery locations against tactical maps. The weapons had been seized across different engagements, separated by time and geography. There was no operational reason for such consistency, unless the orcs were deliberately manufacturing to specification, unless they were coordinating production. I drafted a preliminary note and forwarded it to my supervisor, Logister Secundus Harron. His response arrived within the hour. He thanked me for my diligence and instructed me to reclassify the observation as material variance notation rather than pattern assessment. He explained that pattern assessment implied analytical conclusions which were outside our purview. We documented. We did not interpret. I revised the notation and resubmitted. Harron approved it, without comment. That night, I attended evening prayer in the bunker's chapel. The space was cramped, barely large enough for 8 supplicants. The priest, an elderly man with cataracts and trembling hands, led us through the standard recitations. We prayed for strength. We prayed for the Emperor's guidance. We prayed for victory over the Xenos. The words felt rote. I spoke them anyway. After prayer, I returned to my quarters and lay in the dark. I thought about the weapons. I thought about the banner. I thought about the tallies that predicted our dead. I thought about doctrine and how it explained everything except what I had seen. I thought about belief. The catechisms taught that orcs were sustained by instinct and savagery. They lacked the capacity for faith because they lacked the capacity for doubt. They simply were. This was what made them dangerous, but ultimately manageable. They could be counted, measured, destroyed. The Imperium's certainty would outlast their numbers, but if the orcs believed something, if they held to it with the same absolute conviction that we held to our faith, what then? If their belief was strong enough to shape reality, even slightly, even locally, what would that mean for our doctrine? What would it mean for our certainty? I did not have answers. I had only questions that felt dangerous to ask. The campaign continued. I performed my duties. I reconciled casualty lists, verified supply consumption, catalogued recovered materiel. Each report was accurate. Each notation followed correct format. I spoke only when necessary and avoided speculation. I was a model scribe. On the 18th day, a tactical briefing was held for senior personnel. I was not invited, but the summary was distributed to all administratum staff. The brief detailed a successful operation against an orc fortification in the western Underhive. Imperial forces had breached the position and secured significant intelligence materials, including what the report described as crude battle plans. The plans were noted as unusually detailed for orc craftsmanship. I requested access to the recovered materials for cataloging purposes. The request was approved. The materials were delivered to the archive station the following morning, sealed in evidence crates marked with purity seals and quarantine warnings. I opened the first crate and found stacks of metal plates etched with orc glyphs. The etchings depicted hive geography with surprising accuracy. Major transit routes were marked. Imperial strong points were indicated. Supply depots were circled. The plates were organized by sector, each sector corresponding to a different phase of operations. Future operations. I compared the plates against current tactical deployments. Several matched exactly. Others depicted positions that had not yet been established but were scheduled for construction within the next 2 weeks. The orcs had mapped our intentions before we executed them. I sat motionless, stylus hovering over my slate. The archive station was silent except for the hum of climate control. The other scribes were on different shifts. I was alone with the plates. I thought about reporting this. I thought about the proper notation format. I thought about Senior Logister Ven's instructions to avoid speculation. I thought about Harron's preference for material variance over pattern assessment. I thought about the commendation in my record, the praise for restraint. I thought about the banner, suspended in study, examined by people who understood things I did not. I photographed the plates. I logged them as enemy intelligence materiel, classification crude strategic documentation. I noted the geographic accuracy, but attributed it to opportunistic observation of visible Imperial activity. I did not mention the future deployments. I did not mention the timeline discrepancies. I documented what was required and nothing more. The notation felt like cowardice. That night I could not pray. The words would not form. I lay in my bunk and stared at the ceiling. I thought about the 88th Cadian soldiers in the trenches above, unaware that the enemy already knew where they would be tomorrow. I thought about the commanders planning operations that the Orcs had already mapped. I thought about the system that demanded I observe this and say nothing. I thought about faith and whether it was supposed to require blindness. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Logister Secundus Harron. He received me in his office, a slightly larger compartment distinguished by a real wooden desk and a wall-mounted Aquila. I stood at attention and explained my concern as carefully as possible. I emphasized the accuracy of the Orc plates. I noted the temporal discrepancies. I asked if this warranted escalation to tactical command. Harron listened without interruption. When I finished, he was silent for 11 seconds. Then he asked if I was familiar with the concept of Orc Kunin. I replied that I was not. He explained that Orcs possessed a crude, low-level intelligence that occasionally manifested as rudimentary tactical awareness. This Kunin was not true strategy, but rather animal instinct elevated by psychic feedback. When many Orcs gathered, their collective belief in their own cleverness created a minor warp resonance that enhanced their instinctual responses. This was why large Orc warbands sometimes appeared coordinated, despite lacking formal command structures. The plates, he said, were likely created after observing Imperial movements, not before. Orcs were skilled scavengers. They watched, they copied, they anticipated based on pattern recognition. The temporal discrepancies I had noted were probably errors in our intelligence dating, not predictive accuracy. He asked if this explanation was satisfactory. I said it was. He nodded and dismissed me. As I reached the door, he spoke again. He said that excessive focus on anomalies could lead to unproductive anxiety. The administratum valued precision, yes, but also perspective. Not every irregularity required investigation. Some simply required correct notation and faith that the system would function as designed. I thanked him for his guidance. I returned to my station and resumed cataloging. The plates were filed and sealed. The notation was approved. The system absorbed the discrepancy without concern. I wondered if I was the only one who saw it. The weeks accumulated like sediment. Each day identical in structure, differentiated only by the specific numbers I recorded. Casualties rose and fell within expected parameters. Supply consumption tracked predicted curves. Enemy contact reports showed the usual patterns: aggressive probing, mass assaults, tactical withdrawal when losses exceeded sustainability. Everything was proceeding correctly. I attended prayers. I maintained my routines. I submitted reports that met all standards. I avoided speculation. I spoke only when necessary. I was efficient, obedient, precise. I was exactly what the administratum required. I was also afraid. The fear was not dramatic. It did not manifest as panic or despair. It was quiet and constant. A low hum beneath every task. I felt it when reviewing casualty lists, wondering if the numbers had already been counted somewhere I could not see. I felt it when cataloging recovered weapons, noticing the consistency that should not exist. I felt it during prayers, when the words felt like they were dissolving before reaching the Emperor's ears. I told no one. Fear was weakness. Weakness implied doubt. Doubt implied heresy. I maintained my composure and performed my duties. The fear remained private, manageable, buried beneath routine. On the 43rd day, the Orcs launched a major offensive against Hive Tertius. The attack came at dawn, coordinated across 7 entry points simultaneously. Imperial defenses held, but casualties were severe. The Munitorum archive station was placed on alert status. We worked in shifts around the chronometer, processing casualty reports as they arrived from the front. I worked the night shift, alone in the archive. The reports came in steady streams, each one requiring verification against unit rosters, injury classification, and resource expenditure. The work was mechanical but demanding. I fell into rhythm: read, verify, classify, record. Read, verify, classify, record. At 3:17, a report arrived from a forward observation post. The report detailed an orc assault on a supply depot that had been established only hours before. The depot's location was classified. Only regimental command knew its exact coordinates. Yet the orcs had concentrated their attack precisely there, bypassing other targets to strike at the most valuable concentration of munitions. I cross-referenced the timing. The depot had been activated at 22:40. The orc attack commenced at 23:15. 35 minutes. I thought about the metal plates with their accurate maps of positions not yet built. I thought about the banner with its tallies of deaths not yet suffered. I thought about Harren's explanation of orc cunning, their pattern recognition and instinctual anticipation. 35 minutes was not pattern recognition. 35 minutes was knowledge. I sat motionless, the report glowing on my slate. The archive was silent except for the ventilation system's whisper. I should have logged the report and continued processing. I should have maintained rhythm. Instead, I opened a new file and began searching. I searched for every engagement over the past 43 days where orcs had struck at newly established or classified positions. I found 17 incidents. In each case, the time between Imperial activation and orc attack was less than 2 hours. In 6 cases, it was less than 30 minutes. I compiled the data into a table. I calculated probability distributions. The likelihood of this occurring through pattern recognition alone was statistically negligible. The likelihood of it occurring through coincidence was mathematically absurd. The orcs knew. They knew before we moved. They knew where we would be. I stared at the data and felt something crack inside my chest. Not faith. Faith remained, but certainty. The absolute confidence that doctrine explained reality. That confidence fractured, and cold air rushed in. I deleted the analysis. I logged the supply depot attack as standard enemy engagement. I submitted the casualty report without notation. I continued processing the queue. When my shift ended at 6, I returned to my quarters. I did not sleep. I lay still and tried to pray. The words would not come. I tried to recite catechisms. They felt like empty sounds. I thought about the orcs in their fortifications, carving marks into metal, counting our dead before we fell. I thought about them believing they would win, believing it so hard that reality bent to accommodate them. I thought about the Imperium's vast machinery of war, its perfect calculations and doctrinal certainty, all of it grinding forward while the enemy simply believed harder. I thought about what would happen if I reported what I had seen. Nothing would happen. That was the horror. The data would be reviewed, reclassified, explained away. Harren would thank me for my diligence and remind me that interpretation was not my role. Senior administrators would note the anomaly and file it under statistical variance. The system would absorb it without changing, because changing would mean admitting that doctrine was incomplete. That faith required doubt. That certainty could be wrong. The system could not afford that admission. I could not afford to make it. I rose and performed my morning ablutions. I sanctified my ink. I reported to the archive station and resumed my duties. I logged casualties. I catalogued materiel. I verified supply consumption. The numbers flowed through my hands, clean and precise, each one correct and meaningless. On the 47th day, I was summoned to a briefing. The summons came from Tactical Command, signed by a colonel whose name I recognized from casualty reports. I arrived at the designated time, carrying my slate and seal case. The briefing room was a reinforced chamber deep in the command bunker, its walls covered with tactical displays and Vox equipment. 3 officers were present. The colonel sat at the head of a metal table. A commissar stood against the wall, hands clasped behind his back. A tech priest occupied a corner, mechadendrites coiled like sleeping serpents. The colonel gestured for me to sit. I obeyed. He asked if I understood why I had been summoned. I replied that I did not. He nodded and activated a data projector. An image appeared on the wall, one of the orc metal plates, enlarged to show detail. The colonel explained that tactical analysis had flagged inconsistencies in my cataloging notation. Specifically, my description of the plates as crude conflicted with their demonstrated geographic precision. He wanted clarification. Had I examined the plates thoroughly? Had I compared them against current deployments? I replied that I had performed standard cataloging as per protocol. I had noted the geographic accuracy but attributed it to opportunistic observation. The colonel asked if I believed that explanation. I hesitated. The commissar shifted weight. The tech priest's optics focused on me with mechanical precision. I felt the weight of correct answer pressing down. I thought about the banner. I thought about deletion orders and commendations for restraint. I said I believed what doctrine taught. The colonel studied me for 17 seconds. Then he deactivated the projector and leaned back. He said that doctrine was essential but not omniscient. The Imperium faced enemies who defied easy categorization. Orcs, in particular, demonstrated capabilities that standard analysis struggled to accommodate. This did not mean doctrine was wrong. It meant reality was complex. He asked if I had observed other anomalies during my time on Veraxis. I thought about the weapon's consistency, the predicted casualties, the 35-minute response time. I thought about the quiet fear that followed me through every shift, the sense of watching something vast and terrible that doctrine refused to name. I said I had observed minor irregularities, nothing beyond normal variance. The colonel nodded slowly. He said that he appreciated my adherence to protocol. Restraint was valuable, but so was complete reporting. If I observed anything that seemed genuinely anomalous, anything that might affect tactical planning, I was to report it immediately, not through standard channels, directly to him. He dismissed me. I returned to the archive station. My hands were shaking. I attributed this to fatigue. I resumed my duties and worked through the afternoon without break. The numbers flowed. The reports accumulated. Everything proceeded correctly. That night, I broke protocol. I accessed the archive's secure database using my authorized credentials. I searched for historical records of orc campaigns across the sector. I compiled engagement timelines, casualty ratios, tactical patterns. I searched for any notation similar to what I had observed, predictive accuracy, impossible knowledge, belief that shaped outcome. I found traces, scattered references in old reports, buried in footnotes and appendices. Observations that orc attacks sometimes coincided with Imperial weaknesses before those weaknesses developed. Notes about enemy movements that seemed uncannily timed. Mentions of captured materials showing knowledge the orcs should not possess. Each observation was followed by standard explanations: coincidence, opportunism, statistical variance. The pattern was consistent. Acknowledge the anomaly, provide conventional interpretation, move forward. Never investigate, never question, never suggest that doctrine might be insufficient. I compiled 17 examples across 8 campaigns. The pattern was undeniable, the explanations were identical. The system had been observing this for decades and choosing not to see it. I saved the compilation to a secure file. I did not know what I would do with it. I simply needed it to exist outside my head, needed confirmation that I was not imagining this. I closed the database and sat in darkness. The archive station was empty. The other scribes were sleeping. I was alone with numbers that revealed too much and a system that demanded I ignore them. I thought about the colonel's offer to report directly. I thought about what would happen if I presented this compilation. Court-martial, memory redaction, execution for undermining morale, or worse, nothing. acknowledgement, and filed dismissal. Thank you for your diligence, scribe. We'll take it from here. The data would disappear. I would be reassigned. The pattern would continue. I deleted the compilation. I purged the search history. I returned to my quarters and attempted prayer. The words came mechanically, drained of conviction but still necessary. Faith was not feeling. Faith was persistence. I did not sleep. The campaign ground forward. Weeks became months. Casualty rates stabilized within acceptable ranges. Supply lines held. The orcs were contained, reduced, systematically eliminated. Victory was not imminent but inevitable. This was doctrine. This was faith. I continued my duties. I documented the slow violence of attrition warfare with the same precision I had maintained since assignment. My reports were exemplary. My notation discipline remained flawless. I received no further summons from tactical command. The colonel's offer hung in the air, unaccepted, slowly fading into irrelevance. I learned to manage the fear, not overcome it, but accommodate it. The fear became part of the routine, integrated like the morning ablutions and evening prayers. I woke afraid. I worked afraid. I slept afraid when sleep came. But I functioned. That was sufficient. On the 79th day, the orcs launched another major offensive. This one targeted multiple hives simultaneously, suggesting coordination across the entire theater. Imperial forces responded with overwhelming firepower. The offensive collapsed within 18 hours, leaving thousands of greenskin dead. The archive station received casualty reports in overwhelming volume. We worked without breaks, processing the flood of data. I worked until my vision blurred, until the numbers became abstract symbols divorced from meaning. 1,600 dead at Hive Tertius, 900 at Hive Secundus, 4,000 wounded, 300 missing. Each number was a human being. Each number was a life ended or broken. I knew this intellectually. I could not feel it. The scale defeated empathy. I could only count. During a brief respite, Logister Secundus Haran approached my station. He looked fatigued, his augmented eyes dimmer than usual. He asked if I was maintaining acceptable performance levels. I assured him I was. He nodded and placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie that felt foreign and uncomfortable. He said that work like ours was essential but often thankless. The battlefield received glory. Command received recognition. But the administratum maintained the invisible architecture that made victory possible. Without our documentation, without our precision, the Imperium would collapse into chaos. He said I should remember this during difficult periods, remember that numbers were not cold, they were sacred. Each tally was a prayer. Each casualty report was a memorial. We honored the dead by counting them correctly. I thanked him for the reminder. He squeezed my shoulder and departed. I returned to processing reports. The numbers continued their procession. 1,600, 900, 4,000, 300. I wondered if the orcs had already counted them. That night, exhausted beyond coherence, I finally slept. I dreamed of tallies again. But this time they were different. Instead of marks on hide, they were carved into my own skin. Vertical lines etched into my arms, my chest, my face. Each mark representing a death I had documented. Each mark permanent and precise. In the dream, I tried to wash them away. The marks remained. I tried to cover them with clothing. They showed through. I tried to cut them out. They went deeper than flesh, carved into bone, into marrow, into the foundation of what I was. I woke gasping, hands clutching at unmarked skin. The chronometer read 4:23. I lay still and focused on breathing. In, out, controlled. I thought about Haran's words. Each tally was a prayer, each number sacred. I thought about the orcs carving their tallies into banners and plates, marking victories before they occurred, their belief making each mark true. What if we were doing the same thing? What if our meticulous documentation, our sacred enumeration, Our absolute faith in numbers was feeding something we did not understand. What if the orcs did not predict our casualties but read them from our own conviction that they would occur? The thought felt like heresy. I forced it away. I rose and performed my ablutions early. I needed routine. I needed the familiar structure of duty. I reported to the archive station at 5:30, 90 minutes before my scheduled shift. The station was empty. I activated my slate and began reviewing pending reports. The work was soothing. Numbers flowed in predictable patterns. I verified, classified, recorded. The rhythm pushed away dangerous thoughts. At 7:15, Harren arrived. He seemed surprised to find me already working. He asked if I had slept. I said I had. He studied me for a moment, then nodded and moved to his own station. We worked in parallel silence. At 9, a priority message arrived. The message was brief. I was to report to the upper administrative levels immediately. The summons came from Senior Logister Ven. I had not seen or heard from Ven since the transit 6 months ago. His reappearance felt ominous. I gathered my slate and seal case and departed. Harren watched me go but said nothing. The upper administrative levels occupied reinforced chambers above the main bunker complex. The corridors were wider, the air cleaner. Actual paintings hung on the walls, depicting imperial victories and saints in devotion. I followed the designated route and arrived at an ornate door marked with the administratum seal. I knocked. A voice bid me enter. The office was expansive by bunker standards, furnished with proper wooden furniture and climate control. Senior Logister Ven sat behind a desk covered with neatly stacked parchments. His wet, magnified eyes tracked me as I entered. He gestured to a chair. I sat. He asked how I was adapting to Varaxis Prime. I replied that I was performing my duties adequately. He nodded and asked about my recent work. I summarized my assignments: casualty, reconciliation, material cataloging, standard documentation. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he was silent for 19 seconds. Then he opened a drawer and removed a data slate. He placed it on the desk between us. The slate displayed a file, my compilation of historical orc anomalies, the one I had deleted. My blood became cold. Ven asked if I recognized the file. I said I did. He asked why I had created it. I said I was attempting to identify patterns that might be relevant to tactical planning. He asked why I had deleted it. I said I determined it was outside my purview. He nodded slowly. His augmented eyes reflected the slate's glow. He said that deletion was not erasure. The Administratum's data architecture preserved all access records, all file creations, all modifications. Nothing was truly removed. It simply became archived. He asked if I understood the implications of compiling such data without authorization. I said I did not. He explained that pattern analysis required specific training and clearance. Unauthorized analysis could lead to incorrect conclusions. Incorrect conclusions could spread. They could undermine morale. They could create doubt where certainty was required. He asked if I had shared the compilation with anyone. I said I had not. He asked if I had discussed the underlying observations with anyone. I hesitated. The commissar at the briefing, the colonel who had offered direct reporting, Harren, in oblique terms. I said I had made general inquiries within proper channels. Ven's expression did not change. He said that general inquiries were acceptable, compilation and analysis were not. The distinction was important. He deactivated the slate and returned it to the drawer. He said that my work was valued, but that I was demonstrating signs of overextension. Prolonged exposure to casualty documentation could induce cognitive strain. This was recognized and manageable. He was transferring me to a new assignment. Effective immediately, I would join the archival staff at Administratum Reserve Station Theta 9, a rear echelon facility 3 systems away. My duties would focus on historical record maintenance rather than active campaign documentation. The assignment was permanent. He presented a transfer order. I read it. Everything was correct, properly sealed and authorized. My transport would depart in 36 hours. He asked if I had questions. I asked about the file, about the compilation. Would it be investigated? He said it had been reviewed and deemed the result of excessive diligence rather than malicious intent. It would be archived under my personnel record as evidence of thoroughness requiring redirection. No disciplinary action would be taken. He dismissed me. I returned to the archive station. Harren looked up as I entered. I informed him of my transfer. He expressed surprise and regret, noting that my work had been exemplary. He wished me well in my new assignment. I spent the remaining time organizing my files for transition. The work was mechanical, requiring no thought. My hands moved through familiar motions while my mind remained elsewhere. I thought about the banner, preserved somewhere in inquisitorial custody. I thought about the compilation, archived in my record, evidence of thought crimes not quite committed. I thought about Ven's wet eyes and careful words, not punishment, but correction, not censorship, but redirection. The system was perfect in its efficiency. It absorbed dissent without violence, redirected doubt without acknowledgement. It did not need to silence me because it could simply move me, isolate me, ensure my observations remained safely contained. I finished the organization and sealed my final reports. Harren countersigned them. The transition was complete. I was no longer Varaxis Prime's concern. I spent my final night in prayer. The words came more easily now, freed from the weight of active observation. I thanked the Emperor for my service. I asked for strength in my new duties. I prayed for the soldiers still fighting, still dying in patterns the orcs had already counted. I did not pray for understanding. Understanding was no longer permitted. Administratum Reserve Station Theta 9 orbited a dead moon in a system whose name I never learned. The station was a converted cargo hauler, its holds transformed into archive vaults and administrative chambers. 400 scribes maintained records stretching back 1100 years. The work was pure maintenance, verifying seal integrity, updating cross-references, transferring documents to new media as old parchment decayed. I reported for duty on the third day after arrival. I was assigned to Vault Section 7, Subsector Historical Compliance Records, Centuries 038, M39 through 041, M39. My duties were clearly defined: examine documents, verify preservation state, note deterioration, recommend conservation measures. No analysis, no synthesis, pure observation. The work was peaceful. I established routines, morning ablutions. Ink sanctification unnecessary, I no longer created documents, only maintained them. Prayer in the station chapel, a converted cargo bay with makeshift altar. 8 hours in the vaults, surrounded by the physical weight of history. Evening meal in the communal refectory, return to quarters, sleep. Days accumulated without distinction, weeks became months. I read casualty reports from wars fought before my birth, verified supply manifests from campaigns forgotten by all but the archive. The documents smelled of age and preservation chemicals. The paper crumbled at the edges, requiring careful handling. I developed a gentle touch, learned to turn pages without damage. I spoke rarely. The other scribes maintained similar silence. We worked in parallel, separated by rows of filing cabinets and the shared understanding that conversation was inefficient. Occasionally, we exchanged necessary information: a filing code, a conservation recommendation. Nothing personal, nothing unnecessary. I should have found peace in this exile. The pressure was gone. No tactical briefings, no casualty reports from yesterday's dead, no orc anomalies requiring notation. Just old paper and ritual preservation. But the fear remained. It was quieter now, less immediate, but it persisted in the gaps between routine. I would be examining a document and notice a casualty figure from an orc campaign. I would pause, wondering if those numbers had been predicted, if somewhere a greenskin had carved tallies before the battle. I would force the thought away and continue working. but it would return during evening prayer or in the space before sleep. On the 47th day at Theta 9, I found a document that stopped me. It was a field report from the Third Compliance War on Armageddon, dated 998, M41. The report detailed Orc tactical movements during the siege of Hive Hades. The author, a now dead Munitorum attaché, noted that enemy forces had concentrated at a reinforced gate despite the presence of weaker entry points. Intelligence could not explain this decision. The reinforced gate was Imperial's strongest position, requiring maximum Orc casualties to breach. The gate fell in 6 hours. Orc losses were catastrophic but acceptable. They had attacked exactly where their casualties would be highest and their victory most costly. As if they believed the cost was worth paying. As if they believed so hard that reality agreed. I read the report 3 times. I checked the date, verified the seal, confirmed authenticity. The report was genuine. The observation was clear. The explanation was absent. I placed the document in the conservation queue and noted minor edge deterioration requiring attention. I did not annotate the tactical observation. That was not my role. But I remembered it. I began noticing similar reports, not frequently, but consistently. Observations buried in routine documentation, Orcs attacking fortified positions instead of weak ones. Orcs concentrating forces where Imperial strength was greatest. Orcs winning through conviction rather than strategy. Each report acknowledged the anomaly. Each report provided conventional explanation, or none at all. Each report was filed and forgotten. The pattern was not hidden. It was simply invisible. The administratum had been documenting this for centuries without seeing it, or seeing it and choosing not to understand. I wondered how many other scribes had noticed this. How many had been transferred to quiet postings where dangerous observations could be safely ignored? How many had compiled data and then been redirected before conclusions formed? I wondered if the system was protecting itself or protecting us. On the 73rd day, I received a message from Senior Logister Venn. The message was brief and formal. My performance at Theta 9 was satisfactory. My previous concerns regarding Orc behavioral patterns had been reviewed by appropriate authorities. Conclusive findings were classified, but I was informed that doctrine remained sound. No further investigation was warranted. The message concluded with a reminder that speculation beyond assigned duties could lead to cognitive instability. Faith required trust. Trust required obedience. I was to continue my current assignment indefinitely. I acknowledged receipt. That night I attended prayer. The chapel was nearly empty, only 3 other scribes. The priest was a servitor, its organic components barely visible beneath augmetics. It recited litanies in a flat mechanical tone. We responded with practiced phrases. The ritual was comforting in its emptiness. After prayer, I returned to my quarters. I lay in my bunk and thought about the banner. I wondered where it was now, if it still existed or if it had been destroyed to prevent contamination. I wondered if the tallies had continued updating themselves, carving new deaths into hide that should have been inert. I wondered if faith could be wrong and still be necessary. The Imperium required certainty. Without absolute conviction in its righteousness, in its ultimate victory, the entire structure would collapse. Faith was not metaphor. It was architecture. If the faithful began to doubt, if they began to see the enemy's belief as equally potent, the foundation would crack. The Orcs believed they would win. They believed so completely that their conviction reshaped probability. The Imperium believed it would triumph. It believed so absolutely that doubt was heresy. Both sides sustained reality through faith. Both sides were correct because they believed they were correct. The horror was not that Orcs were terrible. The horror was that they were believers. And belief, unrestrained by doubt, was the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy. I understood now why the system suppressed this knowledge. Not to hide weakness, but to preserve strength. If Imperial forces knew their enemy's faith was as powerful as their own, if they understood that conviction itself was weaponized, the psychological impact would be catastrophic. How could soldiers fight knowing the enemy's certainty matched theirs? How could commanders plan knowing belief could override logistics? The Imperium's only defense was ignorance. Controlled, cultivated ignorance. The system required scribes who documented without understanding, soldiers who fought without questioning, commanders who planned without acknowledging what they could not explain. The system required me to forget what I had learned. I closed my eyes and attempted prayer. The words came automatically, shaped by decades of repetition. I asked the Emperor for guidance. I asked for strength. I asked for peace. The Emperor did not answer. The Emperor never answered. Faith did not require response. Faith required persistence. I persisted. The months continued their slow accumulation. I worked in the vaults. I maintained documents. I attended prayers. I spoke little. I thought less. The routines protected me from dangerous reflection. I became efficient, mechanical, safe. On the 147th day, a new scribe arrived at Theta 9. She was young, recently graduated from Administratum Schola. She was assigned to my vault section for training. Her name was Kellen. I was instructed to teach her proper preservation techniques. We worked in silence for the first week. I demonstrated correct handling procedures. She observed and replicated. Her technique was adequate, if overly cautious. I corrected minor errors without comment. She accepted correction without question. On the 8th day, she asked a question. We were examining casualty reports from an ancient Orc campaign on a world whose name had been expunged. Kellen noticed that enemy force estimates consistently exceeded visual confirmation. She asked why the Administratum would maintain obviously inflated numbers. I explained that numbers were maintained as recorded, regardless of accuracy. Our role was preservation, not verification. Historical documents were treated as primary sources, even when contradictory. She accepted this and continued working. But the question lingered in the air between us. I recognized the tone, the quiet curiosity that preceded observation, the seed of doubt seeking nourishment. I should have reinforced doctrine. I should have reminded her that questions led to speculation, speculation to instability. I should have protected her from the path I had walked. Instead, I said nothing. We continued working. Kellen occasionally asked questions, always politely, always within acceptable bounds. I answered when answer was appropriate. I deflected when deflection was safer. The weeks passed. On the 168th day, Kellen found a document that stopped her. She read it twice, then asked if I would verify something. I moved to her station. She pointed to a casualty report from the Second War for Armageddon. The report listed Orc losses at a specific engagement, 4,312 dead. The number matched a tally notation on a captured banner described 3 paragraphs later. The banner had been raised before the engagement. The report noted this as evidence of Orc aggressive confidence, but provided no further analysis. Kellen asked how the Orcs could have counted their own dead before dying. I stood silent. The question hung between us, dangerous and clear. I could dismiss it. I could explain it away using Harron's theories of canon and pattern recognition. I could redirect her attention to proper preservation protocols. I could protect her. Instead, I told her the truth. I told her about the banner at the compliance moon, about the tallies that predicted our casualties, about the metal plates showing positions not yet built, about the compilation I had created and deleted, about Ven's careful redirection and my exile to Theta 9. I told her that the Imperium had been observing this pattern for centuries, that every scribe who noticed was redirected or redacted, that the system required ignorance to function. I told her that Orcs were terrifying not because they were savage, but because they believed, and belief was a weapon doctrine could not counter. Kellen listened without interruption. When I finished, she was silent for 47 seconds. Then she asked what she should do with this information. I said I did not know. She asked if she should report it. I said reporting would change nothing. The system would absorb her observation, thank her for diligence, and reassign her somewhere even more remote than Theta 9. She asked if we should simply ignore it. I said that was what the Imperium required. She nodded slowly. She returned to her station and continued working. We did not speak of it again. But something had changed. I had transmitted the knowledge. I had contaminated another scribe with understanding that could not be unlearned. The system had tried to contain this revelation within me. I had broken containment. I felt no satisfaction, only a deep, cold dread. That night I lay awake, wondering if Kellen would report our conversation. If I would be summoned again, this time not for transfer but for something more permanent. Memory redaction, servitor conversion, execution for undermining faith. Morning came without incident. I reported to the vaults. Kellen was already working, her technique unchanged. She greeted me with a small nod. We resumed our parallel duties. Days passed. No summons arrived. No new messages from Ven. The routine continued unbroken. I began to wonder if the system even cared. If knowledge could spread freely so long as it remained contained within institutions designed to render it harmless. Theta 9 was a tomb for dangerous thoughts. Scribes could believe whatever they wished here. The knowledge would die with us, buried under centuries of archived parchment. We were not silenced. We were simply made irrelevant. The realization brought neither comfort nor despair, only a hollow acknowledgement of how the system truly functioned. It did not need to suppress truth. It simply needed to ensure truth remained powerless. On the 203rd day, the station received an emergency bulletin. An Orc Warg had erupted in a neighboring sector. Fleet elements were being redeployed. Munitorum assets were being mobilized to support the campaign. Theta 9 was to prepare for potential reassignment of personnel. The bulletin included casualty projections. Conservative estimates placed Imperial losses at 40,000 over the 18-month campaign timeline. Optimistic estimates suggested 32,000. Worst-case scenarios approached 90,000. I read the projections and wondered if the Orcs had already counted them. I wondered if they were counting even now, carving tallies into banners that would later be recovered and catalogued and explained away. I wondered if scribes in that theater would notice the patterns and be redirected to stations like Theta 9. I wondered if the cycle would continue unchanged until the Imperium collapsed under the weight of its own ignorance. I wondered if collapse would even matter, if the Orcs would simply continue believing, their convictions sustaining them through whatever came after. Kellen approached my station. She asked if I thought we would be reassigned. I said it was possible but unlikely. Theta 9's primary function was archive maintenance. Combat theaters required different specialists. She nodded. Then she asked if the projections were accurate. I said they were calculated using established methodologies. Historical precedent, force composition analysis, terrain assessment. The Administratum's predictive models were sophisticated and well tested. She asked if I believed them. I thought about answering. I thought about doctrine and faith and the necessity of certainty. I thought about Ven's instructions and Harren's reminders. I thought about all the careful explanations I had been given, all the redirections and reassurances. I said I believed what I was required to believe. Kellen studied me for 11 seconds, then she returned to her station without further comment. The bulletin updates continued for 6 days. The Warg was larger than initial reports suggested. Fleet redeployment was accelerating. Casualty projections were revised upward. 48,000, 55,000, 63,000. On the 7th day, the updates stopped. We received no explanation. The silence felt deliberate. I continued my duties. I examined documents. I noted deterioration. I recommended conservation measures. The work proceeded with mechanical regularity. But I had changed. Something fundamental had shifted during the conversation with Kellen. I had spoken the truth aloud, made it real through articulation. The knowledge was no longer contained within my thoughts. It existed in the world, shared and acknowledged. I felt exposed, as if I had removed armor I did not know I was wearing. That night during prayer, I attempted the familiar recitations. The words felt different now, not false, but insufficient. I asked the Emperor for guidance, knowing guidance would not come. I asked for strength, knowing strength was my responsibility. I asked for faith, knowing faith required more than asking. The servitor priest concluded the litany. We filed out of the chapel in silence. I returned to my quarters and lay in darkness. I thought about the banner. I thought about Kellen. I thought about the thousands of scribes across the Imperium, each maintaining their small section of the archive, each potentially noticing patterns they were trained to ignore. I thought about the orcs, believing they would win, their conviction reshaping reality, one engagement at a time. I thought about the Imperium, believing in its ultimate triumph, its doctrine requiring absolute certainty even as evidence accumulated against it. Both sides sustained by faith, both sides vulnerable to doubt, both sides locked in a war where belief itself was the deciding factor. The orcs were terrifying because they understood this instinctively. They did not question their conviction. They simply believed, absolutely and completely, that they would triumph, and the galaxy, shaped by psychic resonance and warp reality, accommodated that belief. The Imperium could not acknowledge this. To do so would be to admit that faith was not unique to humanity. That conviction was a weapon available to all. That the Emperor's light might not be inherently superior to orc certainty. The system required ignorance not as a flaw but as a feature. Doubt would spread like infection if allowed. Soldiers would hesitate. Commanders would question. The entire war machine would grind to paralysis. So the system suppressed. It redirected. It archived dangerous knowledge in places like Theta 9, where understanding could exist but never influence. It memory redacted those who pushed too far. It maintained doctrine through controlled information and enforced faith. It was perfect in its terrible efficiency. I understood this. I accepted it. But I could not unknow what I had learned. The terror was not the orc. The terror was the knowledge that belief itself was weaponized. That conviction reshaped reality. That faith, untempered by doubt, was the most dangerous force in the galaxy. And the Imperium had built itself entirely on that foundation. The months continued their procession. I worked. I prayed. I maintained silence. Kellen and I exchanged necessary information but avoided deeper conversation. The knowledge existed between us, acknowledged but unspoken. On the 309th day, I received a final message from Senior Logister Ven. The message was brief. My service record had been reviewed. I was commended for diligence and adaptability. I would remain at Theta 9 indefinitely. My work was valued. The administratum was satisfied. The message concluded with a single line: faith requires trust. Trust requires obedience. I archived the message and returned to work. I examined a document from an ancient campaign, casualty figures from an orc war on a dead world. The numbers were precise, the tallies exact, the pattern clear to anyone who looked. I noted minor preservation issues and moved to the next document. The work continued. The routine persisted. Faith remained intact but hollowed, a structure maintained through habit rather than conviction. I performed my duties without belief, obeyed without certainty. I had become exactly what the system required, a functionary who knew too much but could do nothing, a repository for dangerous truth that would die with me, safely contained within an archive station orbiting a forgotten moon. I thought about the soldiers dying in the current WARG. I thought about the scribes documenting their deaths, noting the patterns, being reassigned when they asked the wrong questions. I thought about the endless cycle of observation and suppression, knowledge and ignorance, faith and fear. I thought about the orcs, believing they would win. I thought about the Imperium, believing it would triumph. Both sides sustained by conviction, both sides correct because they believed they were correct. The terror was complete now, not dramatic, Not overwhelming, just present, constant, unavoidable. I knew what the enemy truly was. Not a savage, not a beast, a believer. And I knew what the Imperium required of me. Not understanding, not truth, just obedience. I obeyed. I worked through the afternoon, examining documents that would outlive me. I attended evening prayer and spoke words I no longer felt. I returned to my quarters and lay in darkness, waiting for sleep that came slowly. Tomorrow would be identical. And the day after. And the day after. The routine would protect me, the system would sustain me, faith would persist without belief. I would continue counting deaths that had already been counted. I would preserve records that documented patterns no one would acknowledge. I would serve the Imperium by maintaining ignorance that kept it functional. This was my purpose. This was my duty. This was my faith. It was sufficient because it had to be. The alternative was doubt, and doubt was the only heresy the Imperium could not forgive.